The forge fire had been burning since before dawn. Rowan Ashveil did not sleep on nights before a market run. He never had, not in 22 years of hammering iron in the town of Graymere, and he saw no reason to start now. Sleep was a luxury for men who did not owe 3 months of grain debt to Miller Hendros, or whose eldest daughter had not just broken her only pair of boots on the frost-bitten road to the well. Rowan was not that kind of man. He was the other kind, the kind who pressed his palms flat against the cooling anvil at midnight and breathed slowly, reminding himself that the fire would come back in the morning, that iron could always be reshaped, that things would improve. He told himself this with less conviction every year. By the time the sun cracked the horizon over the Ashveil Hills, hills named after his grandfather, a fact that now felt more like mockery than pride, Rowan had already loaded his cart with the week's work. 12 horseshoes, 8 door hinges, 2 sets of plow blades, and a decorative gate latch he'd spent 4 evenings on. One he hoped would fetch enough coin from the merchant Calloway to cover at least part of what he owed Hendros. He covered the cart with a oiled cloth against the morning mist, whistled for his old mare Bessie, and began the slow roll toward Graymere's weekly market. The road from his forge to the market square cut through the edge of the Briarwood, a narrow corridor of ancient trees that most Graymere residents avoided after nightfall. In daylight it was merely unpleasant, the path too narrow, the roots too eager to catch a wagon wheel, the shadows too purple and deep even in full sun. Rowan had been walking it for 22 years, and the discomfort had long since dissolved into mere awareness. He knew every root, every low-hanging branch, every suspicious puddle that was deeper than it looked. He did not know the figure crouched at the base of the old split oak. He almost missed her entirely. She was small, much smaller than he'd expected, though he would not have been able to tell you what he'd expected, given he'd had no expectation at all. She was tucked against the roots of the split oak like something the tree had partially swallowed. Knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, green-gray skin almost the same color as the moss and bark. A goblin woman, clearly, with the characteristic wide jaw and large amber eyes, though those eyes were currently squeezed shut, and her whole small body was shaking with a trembling she seemed to be fighting to suppress. Rowan slowed Bessie with a word. The mare, who had no history of being bothered by unusual things, simply stopped and waited. The goblin woman did not look up. "You all right?" Rowan asked. It was perhaps not the most elegant opening, but it was honest. She flinched. Her eyes opened, huge, amber, ringed red from crying. And for one moment, she looked at him with an expression of pure animal terror, the kind of look a creature gives when it has learned that being found usually leads to something worse. Then something in her seemed to collapse inward. The terror didn't leave her face exactly, but it was joined by something heavier, something exhausted past the point of performance. "Go away," she said. Her voice was rough, lower than he'd expected. "Are you hurt? Go away, human." Rowan looked at her for a moment. He was not an especially perceptive man in many ways. His wife Mira had told him so with affection on many occasions. But he had spent 22 years reading iron, and iron, like people, told you things if you learned to look. This woman was not just frightened. She was at the end of something. He recognized it the way you recognize a road you've walked before, even when the light is different. He climbed down from the cart. She was on her feet immediately, backing against the oak, her hands coming up, not threateningly but defensively, the way someone does when they have nothing left to fight with but haven't entirely surrendered the habit. "I'm not going to hurt you," Rowan said. He put his hands out, open, palms up. Blacksmith's hands, broad and scarred. "My name's Rowan. I'm going to market. The town's about a mile that way." He pointed. "Are you coming from somewhere or going somewhere?" A long silence. She was watching his hands. "Neither," she said finally. That was not an answer he knew what to do with. He stood there for a moment in the early morning, the forge smoke still faintly in his hair, the light shifting green through the briarwood leaves, and made a decision that was not really a decision at all, more like the absence of any other option that seemed acceptable. "I have bread," he said. "In the cart. I was going to eat it on the road. Do you want some?" She looked at him like he had said something in a language she recognized but hadn't spoken in years. "No," she said, very quickly. "Then, how much bread?" Her name was Vreth. She told him this in a voice that suggested the information was being surrendered rather than offered. She sat on the cart beside him. Not easily, not comfortably, but with the deliberateness of someone who had made a strategic decision, and ate the bread he gave her with a focused intensity that made him look away. A person eats like that when they haven't eaten in a while. He didn't ask about it immediately. He let her eat. He let the cart find the road's rhythm and let Bessie amble at her own pace. Vreth had the bread gone in perhaps 2 minutes, and then sat with her hands in her lap and her jaw set and her eyes fixed straight ahead on the road. "Where are you from?" he asked, when the silence had lasted long enough to be companionable rather than tense. "The Hollowwood." She said it without inflection, the way people name places they expect you've never heard of. He had heard of it, vaguely, a settlement of the goblin clans about 12 miles northeast, deeper into the Briarwood territory, mostly off the maps that humans bothered to draw. "Long walk," he said. "Yes." Another silence. "I'm a blacksmith," he said, for no particular reason. "I can smell," she said, which was so unexpectedly direct that he laughed. A short, surprised sound. She looked at him sideways, and something very small happened in her expression. Not a smile, not quite, but the preliminary territory of one. "Fair enough," he said. They reached the market square. The stalls were setting up, the familiar morning noise of Graymere washing over them. Calls and countercalls, the thump of crates, the smell of bread from the Hendros bakery stall that always arrived before the miller himself. Rowan pulled the cart into his usual spot near the old fountain and began unloading. Vreth climbed down without a word and stood to the side, watching. He expected her to leave. People who didn't want to be in a place usually left it when they had the chance. She stayed. He set up his display. Iron goods arranged on the low wooden table he'd built specifically for market days, and she watched with the careful attention of someone memorizing something. Not the goods themselves, he realized, but the way the buyers approached, the way money moved. She was learning how the market worked, in the precise and economical way of someone who did not have the luxury of learning slowly. "You've not been to a human market before," he said. It wasn't really a question. "I've been," she said. "Not to buy." He let that sit. By mid-morning he had sold 3 of the horseshoe sets and 1 set of plow blades, which was better than he'd expected. Calloway had not appeared yet. The man operated on a schedule known only to himself and perhaps his horse, but the morning was still young. Vreth had not moved far from the cart. She'd examined the gate latch for several minutes with an expression of professional interest that surprised him. "You make things," she said, setting it back down carefully. "That's the general idea. In the Hollowwood, my husband made things. Woodwork. Good work." She said it without sentimentality, just as information. Past tense. Rowan filed it. "What brought you out this way?" he asked, and he said it gently, the way you lower something fragile onto a surface you're not entirely sure will hold it. Vreth looked at the gate latch for a moment. Then she looked at the crowd moving through the market square. Then she looked at nothing in particular. "My children are hungry," she said. 3 words with 100 words behind them, and Rowan had been alive long enough to hear the ones that weren't said. "How many children?" he asked. 3. A pause. 4. The youngest, she's very young. Another pause. "I walked here because the elders in the Hollowwood said there was nothing to spare." They weren't lying. There isn't. The blight took the mushroom crop in the spring, and the dried stores ran out 2 weeks ago. She said this the way you confess something, the way you say words out loud that you've been not saying for a long time. Calloway arrived at midday, which was his usual approach. Arrive when people were tired and hungry and less focused on negotiation. He was a large man with a merchant smile that never quite reached his eyes and a habit of picking up items and setting them back down too quickly, as if establishing that he could take or leave anything. He did not buy the gate latch. He offered half of what Rowan needed and shrugged when Rowan said no, and left, which was also his usual approach. Rowan stood for a moment behind his table and breathed carefully. Vreth was watching him with those amber eyes. "The latch," she said. "Is it worth what you asked?" "More," he said. She nodded slowly. "He knows that." "Yes." "Then why didn't he pay it?" "Because he doesn't have to," Rowan said. "There are 3 other blacksmiths in the county, and he knows I need the sale." She was quiet for a moment. "In the Hollowwood," she said, "when someone uses a neighbor's need against them, we call it theft. Just slower theft." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's what it is." She had set out the carved animals on one end of his table, which she'd asked permission to do, speaking to him with a formality that he suspected was not natural to her, but that she was using as a kind of armor. She'd arranged them carefully. The deer, a bear, a running fox, two small birds with their wings slightly spread, a badger, others. They were immediately noticed. 3 people stopped within an hour. 2 bought. She handled the money with steady hands and put it in a fold of her tunic and continued watching the road. By mid-afternoon, she had sold 7 of the 12. A woman who ran the curiosity shop on Fenwick Street bought 4 at once, asking Vreth twice whether she had more, whether she could get more. Vreth said she could not, and the woman looked disappointed but paid the asking price without negotiating, because the work was clearly worth it. Rowan watched this. He watched Vreth count the coin when the curiosity shop woman had gone, her lips moving slightly, doing the math. He watched her expression as the sum became real to her. He watched the very specific quality of relief that moved across her face. Not happiness, not excitement, but the physical release of a pressure that had been building past a bearable point. She looked up and found him watching. "Enough," she said. Her voice was not steady. "It's enough for a week. Maybe more if I'm careful." He didn't say anything. "I should buy the food and go," she said. "I've been gone since yesterday morning." She stopped. "I need to go. I'll walk you to the grain merchant," he said. The grain merchant was Pell, who was a fair man by Graymere standards, which meant he wasn't actively dishonest. He weighed Vreth's coin carefully, said nothing about her being a goblin, and sold her a good sack of millet and 1 of dried peas, which she examined with the attention of someone who had learned to look for mold. There wasn't any. She paid. She slung the sacks over her shoulders with a practiced efficiency, and she turned toward the road that led back to the Briarwood. Rowan was still standing there. "You helped me," she said. "Not as thanks, exactly. More as an accounting. I gave you bread and half a table," he said. "That was enough." She shifted the sack on her shoulder. "Your name?" "Rowan Ashveil." "Yes." "The hills," she said. "Your family." "My grandfather's." She nodded. She was looking at him with the careful, measured look of someone making a decision they weren't entirely sure about. "Come to the Hollowwood," she said. "In 3 weeks. I'll have the rest of the carvings ready. You could sell them for me." He blinked. "I can't get to the market often," she said, very practically. "The walk is long and the children can't always be left. But you're here every week. If you take 20% of the sale." "10," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. 20, she said firmly. "You need to make it worth your trouble. Otherwise you'll stop doing it." He opened his mouth. Closed it. "All right," he said. She nodded once. The matter settled, and turned toward the road. "Vreth," he said. She paused. "How do you know I won't just take the money?" She looked back at him over her shoulder. The afternoon light was in her amber eyes. "I don't," she said simply. "But you gave bread to a stranger for nothing. And you argued yourself down 10%. The very edge of something that was genuinely a smile. You're not that kind of man." She disappeared into the shadows of the Briarwood Road. He went to the Hollowwood 3 weeks later. He had expected. He wasn't entirely sure what he'd expected. Something rougher, perhaps, something more in keeping with the stories Graymere's older residents told about goblin settlements. Stories that had the specific quality of being repeated by people who had never actually visited. What he found instead was a cluster of perhaps 40 low, well-built structures set among the trees with a care that suggested long familiarity with the land. Curved rooftops that channeled rain, doorways oriented away from the prevailing wind, gardens that were mostly bare now but had the structure of something that had once been productive. Children watched him from behind tree trunks. He counted 7 of them in the first 5 minutes, and probably missed several more. Vreth met him at the path's edge. She was wearing a different tunic, cleaner, and her amber eyes were alert rather than exhausted, though the exhaustion was still there underneath if you knew to look. Behind her, half hidden behind the doorframe of the nearest structure, were 3 small faces. A girl of perhaps 10 with her mother's wide jaw and eyes, a boy a few years younger, and a very small creature who he could only see the top of, clinging to the doorframe just below the older children's elbows. "You came," Vreth said, as if this itself was information. "I said I would." She regarded him for a moment. Then she turned and said something over her shoulder in a language he didn't speak. Sharp, clicking consonants, a different music from anything in human language, and the children vanished inside. She brought him to a workspace set apart from the main dwellings, a lean-to structure open on one side, and inside were the carvings. 23 of them. More than she'd said. He picked each one up in turn and she watched without speaking. They were all her husband's work, done before he died. She told Rowan this without being asked. Economically, the way she seemed to do everything. Fever, the previous winter. She said it the way you say a word you've had to say many times. The shock of it had worn off, but the shape of it was still exactly the same. I have my own work too, she said, and brought out 6 small pieces. Different from her husband's. His had been naturalistic, precise, documentary, almost. Hers were stranger, more abstract. The wood was carved into shapes that suggested animals without quite being them, forms that existed at the edge of recognition. He liked them more, which surprised him. These will be harder to sell, he said honestly. I know, she said, equally honest. But I'd rather make what I make. Fair, he said. He sold the carvings over 3 market days. Vreth's pieces went slower than her husband's, but they went, and to the people he'd expected, the artist woman who lived alone above the bookshop, the young man who was studying at the regional academy, a couple from the capital who were visiting Graymere and stopped at his stall and spent 20 minutes looking. The academy student asked if there were more. He said he'd ask. He went back to the Hollowood. This time the children did not hide immediately. The eldest, the girl, came as far as the edge of the lean-to and watched him with unblinking amber eyes while he and her mother talked business. Her name was Siska, Vreth said, and she was learning to carve. He looked at the small practice piece Siska had left on the work table, a lopsided but recognizable bird, the kind of first effort that contains, unmistakably, the seeds of something. She's good, he said. Vreth looked at the piece. I know, she said. There was a quality in her voice that he couldn't name exactly. Something between ferocity and grief, the way people sound when they love something and are afraid for it at the same time. The arrangement continued through the autumn. Rowan learned the path to the Hollowood well enough to walk it in the half-dark. He learned a handful of words in the goblin tongue, greetings, the names of the children, thank you. Later, that's enough, which seemed to come up often. The youngest child, the one who had clung to the doorframe on his first visit, was called Drull, and by the 6th week had taken to following him around the lean-to at a careful distance of about 4 feet, examining everything he touched with a scientific interest. Vreth noticed, but said nothing about it. He told Mira, his wife, about the arrangement early, in the first week, before she'd have reason to wonder where the extra 10% in his accounts was coming from. Mira had listened in the particular way she had of listening, which was to say she listened completely, and then said, "Can the settlement survive the winter?" He'd said he didn't know. She'd said, "Then find out." He found out. The Hollowood had 43 residents, 7 families, 11 children. Their stores, even supplemented by what Vreth was now earning, were thin for the winter ahead. The blight that had taken the mushroom crop in spring had spread to the neighboring settlements, which meant the usual networks of exchange within the goblin communities of the Briarwood were also strained. The elders were calm about it in the way that people are calm when they have done everything they can think of and are now waiting. He brought this back to Mira. She looked at him for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to do something useful," he said. "I don't know what." Mira, who was in many ways sharper than he was, which he had always known and felt nothing but gratitude for, thought for a moment. "You know Calloway paid full price for the Merkle farm gate last spring," she said. "I know. Your gate latch is better than anything Merkle's blacksmith did." "I know. So Calloway knows the work is good. He's paying less than it's worth because he thinks he can." Rowan was quiet. "Make the gate latch part of a larger commission," Mira said. "Make it so he needs more from you. Give him reason to start a relationship rather than a single sale." She paused. "And while you're at it, the curiosity shop woman asked you about more carvings, didn't she?" She asked Vreth directly. "Right. So there's an established buyer. Have you thought about approaching the capital merchants? The ones who came for Vreth's pieces. They knew what they were looking at. People in the capital will pay more." He had not thought about it with that specificity. But Mira had, and she laid it out with such practical clarity that by the end of the evening they had the outline of something that felt less like charity and more like commerce, which was, he suspected, the only form of help that would be acceptable to Vreth anyway. He brought it to her on the next visit. She listened the same way Mira listened, completely. Then she sat with it for a moment. "You've thought about this," she said. "With your wife?" "Yes." "She hasn't met me." "No. But she said," he paused. "She said, you're doing good work, and you should be able to get the price the work deserves. She said that's not charity. That's just correcting an inefficiency in the market. Vreth was quiet for a long moment. Outside the lean-to, Siska was sitting against a tree with her carving tools and a new piece of pale wood, working with a concentration so total she was clearly not listening. Your wife sounds like a sensible person, Vreth said finally. She's the sensible part of us, he agreed. I just hit things with hammers. That got him a full smile. It was the first time he'd seen one, and it changed her face completely. The winter was hard, as Graymere winters always were, but the Hollowwood community came through it. Not easily. There were lean weeks in January and February when the millet had to be rationed more carefully than anyone liked, and Rowan made 2 trips in the snow with supplementary provisions that he and Mira had budgeted for at the autumn's end, and that they presented not as a gift, but as an advance against spring sales, which was technically accurate. The capital buyer, a woman named Alara Strand who ran a gallery for craft and art objects, had placed a standing order for Vreth's pieces and was asking about Siska's work too, though Siska was only 11 and Vreth had feelings about that which she was still working through. The gate latch commission had come through. Calloway had, eventually, come back, because Mira had been right, because the work was better, because Rowan had simply stopped selling to him and sold elsewhere instead, and Calloway was a practical man who preferred profit to stubbornness. They had reached a price that was still below what the work was worth, but was at least in the honest neighborhood of it. On the last day of March, when the snow had mostly cleared and the Hollowwood's garden beds were being turned for spring planting, Rowan made his weekly visit and found Vreth in the lean-to as usual, but with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not relief, not calculation, not the guarded openness she'd developed over the winter. Something lighter than those. The Elder Council, she said, wants to know if you would be willing to sell other craft work from the settlement. Not just mine and Siska's. Pero makes leather goods. She named 3 others. We've been talking. He looked at her. You'd need more percentage, she said, before he could speak. If you're representing more sellers, more complexity, more risk. 30% of the additional sales. 25, he said. 30. She met his eyes. And we'd like to meet your wife. He paused. She'd like to meet you too, he said. She said so. Vreth nodded. The lighter expression was still there. Outside, he could hear Drull, who had now entirely abandoned the 4-foot rule and tended to simply appear at his elbow, making noise about something, and Siska's voice answering, and somewhere further away the sound of the community beginning to wake up into spring. The first day I met you, Vreth said, I was sitting against that tree because I had walked 12 miles and had nothing left. Not strength, not coin, not, she paused. I told myself I was resting, but I was sitting there because I didn't know what else to do. He was quiet. You gave me bread, she said, and a piece of a table, and you argued yourself down 10%. She looked at him with those amber eyes, very directly. You didn't fix anything, but you made it possible for me to fix it myself. That's, she stopped. Then, very precisely, that's the difference. Rowan thought about the forge and the anvil and the way iron could be heated and shaped and cooled into something that would last. He thought about his grandfather and the hills and what it meant for a name to mean something. In the spring, he said, if Siska wants to come to the market herself and see how the selling works, she's old enough to learn. Vreth looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. She is. Outside, the first real warmth of the new season was moving through the Briarwood, and the children of the Hollowwood were running in it. And somewhere in the direction of Graymere, Rowan's forge fire was banked and waiting, patient as iron, ready to become whatever the day needed. Some things, Rowan Ashveil thought, you couldn't make on an anvil. But the principle was the same. You had to start with something real. You had to apply heat. You had to be patient. And you had to trust that what came out the other side would be stronger than what went in. He was not, as Mira had often gently noted, a particularly poetic man. But he understood iron. And iron, in the end, was just another way of saying, things can be changed.